All right, hello and welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with Book 2, Chapter 2. This is a ridiculously long chapter yet again, so we will have to stop in the middle of this chapter on the fly because, like I said a few times already, I've been trying to keep these episodes to roughly a half hour long. That Chapter 2 is entitled Of Money Considered as a Particular Branch of the General Stock of the Society or of the Expense of Maintaining the National Capital. Apparently in 1776 they didn't believe in ergonomic reading and breaking up the chapters into, reasonable lengths so you can have good stopping points, but I digress. So anyways, let's drive right on into Chapter 2 here. Of money considered as a particular branch of the general stock of the society or of the expense of maintaining the national capital. It has been shown in the first book that the price of the greater part of commodities resolves itself into three parts, of which one pays the wages of the labor, another the profits of the stock, and a third the rent of the land which has been employed in producing and bringing them to market. That there are, indeed, some commodities of which the price is made up of two of those parts only, the wages of labor and the profits of stock, and a very few in which it consists altogether in one, the wages of labor. But that the price of every commodity necessarily resolves itself into some one or other, or all of these three parts, every part of it which goes neither to rent nor to wages being necessarily profit to somebody. Since this is the case, it has been observed, with regard to every particular commodity taken separately, it must be so with regard to all the commodities which compose the whole annual produce of the land and labor of every country taken complexly. The whole price or exchangeable value of that annual produce must resolve itself into the same three parts and be parceled out among the different inhabitants of the country, either as the wages of their labor, the profits of their stock, or the rent of their land. But though the whole value of the annual produce of the land and labor of every country is thus divided among and constitutes a revenue to its different inhabitants, yet as in the rent of a private estate we distinguish between the gross rent and the neat rent, so may we likewise in the revenue of all the inhabitants of a great country. The gross rent of a private estate comprehends whatever is paid by the farmer, the neat rent, what remains free to the landlord after deducting the expense of management, of repairs, and all other necessary charges, or what, without hurting his estate, he can afford to place in his stock reserved for immediate consumption, or to spend upon his table, equipage, the ornaments of his house and furniture, his private enjoyments and amusements. His real wealth is in proportion not to his gross, but to his neat rent. The gross revenue of all the inhabitants of a great country comprehends the whole annual produce of their land and labor. The neat revenue, what remains free to them after deducting the expense of maintaining, first their fixed, and secondly their circulating capital, or what, without encroaching upon their capital, they can place in their stock reserved for immediate consumption, or spend upon their subsistence, conveniencies, and amusements. Their real wealth, too, is in proportion not to their gross, but to their neat revenue. The whole expense of maintaining the fixed capital must evidently be excluded from the neat revenue of the society. Neither the materials necessary for supporting their useful machines and instruments of trade, their profitable buildings, etc., nor the produce of the labor necessary for fashioning those materials into the proper form, can ever make any part of it. The price of that labor may indeed make a part of it, as the workmen so employed may place the whole value of their wages in their stock reserve for immediate consumption. But in other sorts of labor, both the price and the produce go to this stock, the price to that of the workmen, the produce to that of other people, whose subsistence, conveniencies, and amusements are augmented by the labor of those workmen. The intention of the fixed capital is to increase the productive powers of labor, or to enable the same number of laborers to perform a much greater quantity of work. In a farm where all the necessary buildings, fences, drains, communications, etc., are in the most perfect good order, the same number of laborers and laboring cattle will raise a much greater produce than in one of equal extent and equally good ground, but not furnished with equal conveniencies. and manufactures the same number of hands assisted with the best machinery will work up a much greater quantity of goods than with more imperfect instruments of trade. The expense which is properly laid out upon a fixed capital of any kind is always repaid with great profit, and increases the annual produce by a much greater value than that of the support which such improvements require. This support, however, still requires a certain portion of that produce. A certain quantity of materials and the labor of a certain number of workmen, both of which might have been immediately employed to augment the food, clothing, and lodging, the subsistence and conveniencies of the society, are thus diverted to another employment, highly advantageous indeed, but still different from this one. It is upon this account that all such improvements in mechanics as enable the same number of workmen to perform an equal quantity of work with cheaper and simpler machinery than had been usual before, are always regarded as advantageous to every society. A certain quantity of materials and the labor of a certain number of workmen, which had before been employed in supporting a more complex and expensive machinery, can afterwards be applied to augment the quantity of work which that or any other machinery is useful only for performing. The undertaker of some great manufactory, who employs 1,000 a year in the maintenance of his industry, of his machinery, if he can reduce this expense to 500, will naturally employ the other 500 in purchasing an additional quantity of materials to be wrought up by an additional number of workmen. The quantity of that work, therefore, which his machinery was useful only for performing, will naturally be augmented, and with it all the advantage and conveniency which the society can derive from that work. The expense of maintaining the fixed capital in a great country may very properly be compared to that of repairs in a private estate. The expense of repairs may frequently be necessary for supporting the produce of the estate, and consequently both the gross and the neat rent of the landlord. When by a more proper direction, however, it can be diminished without occasioning any diminution in price, the gross rent remains at least the same as before, and the neat rent is necessarily augmented. But though the whole expense of maintaining the fixed capital is thus necessarily excluded from the neat revenue of the society, it is not the same case with that of maintaining the circulating capital. Of the four parts of which this latter capital is composed, money, provisions, materials, and finished work, the three last, it has already been observed, are regularly withdrawn from it, and placed either in the fixed capital of the society, or in their stock reserved for immediate consumption. Whatever portion of those consumable goods is not employed in maintaining the former, goes all to the latter, and makes it part of the neat revenue of the society. The maintenance of those three parts of the circulating capital, therefore, withdraws no portion of the annual produce from the neat revenue of the society, besides what is necessary for maintaining the fixed capital. The circulating capital of a society is in this respect different from that of an individual. That of an individual is totally excluded from making any part of his neat revenue, which must consist altogether in his profits. But though the circulating capital of every individual makes a part of that of the society to which he belongs, it is not upon that account totally excluded from making a part likewise of their neat revenue. Though the whole goods in a merchant's shop must by no means be placed in his own stock reserved for immediate consumption, they may in that of other people, who, from a revenue derived from other funds, may regularly replace their value to him together with its profits, without occasioning any diminution either of his capital or of theirs. Money, therefore, is the only part of the circulating capital of a society of which the maintenance can occasion any diminution in their neat revenue. The fixed capital and that part of the circulating capital which consists in money, so far as they affect the revenue of the society, bear a very great resemblance to one another. First, as those machines and instruments of trade, etc., require a certain expense, first to erect them, and afterwards to support them, both which expenses, though they make a part of the gross, are deductions from the neat revenue of the society. So the stock of money which circulates in any country must require a certain expense, first to collect it, and afterwards to support it, both which expenses, though they make a part of the gross, are, in the same manner, deductions from the neat revenue of the society. A certain quantity of very valuable materials, gold and silver, and of very curious labor, Instead of augmenting the stock reserved for immediate consumption, the subsistence conveniencies and amusements of individuals is employed in supporting that great but expensive instrument of commerce, by means of which every individual in the society has his subsistence, conveniencies, and amusements regularly distributed to him in their proper proportion. Secondly, as the machines and instruments of trade, etc., which compose the fixed capital either of an individual or of a society, make no part either of the gross or of the neat revenue of either, so money, by means of which the whole revenue of the society is regularly distributed among all its different members, makes itself no part of that revenue. The great wheel of circulation is altogether different from the goods which are circulated by means of it. The revenue of the society consists altogether in those goods, and not in the wheel which circulates them. In computing either the gross or the neat revenue of any society, we must always, from their whole annual circulation of money and goods, deduct the whole value of the money, of which not a single farthing can ever make any part of either. It is the ambiguity of language only which can make this proposition appear either doubtful or paradoxical. When properly explained and understood, it is almost self-evident. When we talk of any particular sum of money, we sometimes mean nothing but the metal pieces of which it is composed, and sometimes we include in our meaning some obscure reference to the goods which can be had in exchange for it, or to the power of purchasing which the possession of it conveys. Thus, when we say that the circulating money of England has been computed at 18 millions, we mean only to express the amount of the metal pieces, which some writers have computed, or rather have supposed to circulate in that country. But when we say that a man is worth 50 or 100 pounds a year, we mean commonly to express not only the amount of the metal pieces which are annually paid to him, but the value of the goods which he can annually purchase or consume. We mean commonly to ascertain what is or ought to be his way of living, or the quantity and quality of the necessaries and conveniencies of life in which he can with propriety indulge himself. When, by any particular sum of money, we mean not only to express the amount of metal pieces of which it is composed, but to include in its signification some obscure reference to the goods which can be had in exchange for them, the wealth or revenue which it in this case denotes is equal only to one of the two values, which are thus intimated somewhat ambiguously by the same word, and to the latter more properly than to the former, to the money's worth more properly than to the money. Thus, if a guinea be the weekly pension of a particular person, he can in the course of the week purchase with it a certain quantity of subsistence, conveniencies, and amusements. In proportion as this quantity is great or small, so are his real riches, his real weekly revenue. His weekly revenue is certainly not equal both to the guinea and to what can be purchased with it, but only to one or other of those two equal values, and to the latter more properly than to the former, to the guinea's worth rather than to the guinea. If the pension of such a person was paid to him not in gold, but in a weekly bill for a guinea, his revenue surely would not so properly consist in the piece of paper as in what he could get for it. A guinea may be considered as a bill for a certain quantity of necessaries and conveniencies upon all the tradesmen in the neighborhood. The revenue of the person to whom it is paid does not so properly consist in the piece of gold as in what he can get for it, or in what he can exchange it for. If it could be exchanged for nothing, it would, like a bill upon a bankrupt, be of no more value than the most useless piece of paper. Though the weekly or yearly revenue of all the different inhabitants of any country in the same manner may be, and in reality frequently is paid to them in money, their real riches, however, the real weekly or yearly revenue of all of them put together, must always be great or small in proportion to the quantity of consumable goods which they can all of them purchase with this money. The whole revenue of all of them taken together is evidently not equal to both the money and the consumable goods, but only to one or other of those two values, and to the latter more properly than the former. Though we frequently, therefore, express a person's revenue by the metal pieces which are annually paid to him, it is because the amount of those pieces regulates the extent of his power of purchasing, or the value of the goods which he can annually afford to consume. We still consider his revenue as consisting in this power of purchasing or consuming, and not in the pieces which convey it. But if this is sufficiently evident with regard to an individual, it is still more so with regard to a society. The amount of the metal pieces which are annually paid to an individual is often precisely equal to his revenue, and is upon that account the shortest and best expression of its value. But the amount of the metal pieces which circulate in a society can never be equal to the revenue of all of its members. As the same guinea which pays the weekly pension of one man today may pay that of another tomorrow, and that of a third the day after, the amount of the metal pieces which annually circulate in any country be of much less value than the whole money pensions annually paid with. But the power of purchasing, or the goods which can successively be bought with the whole of those successively paid, must always be precisely of the same value, with likewise be the revenue of the different persons to whom they are paid. That revenue, therefore, cannot consist in those metal pieces, of which the amount is so much inferior to its value, but in the power of purchasing in the goods, which can successively be bought with them as they circulate from hand to hand. Money, therefore, the great wheel of circulation, the great instrument of commerce, like all other instruments of trade, though it makes a part and a very valuable part of the capital, makes no part of the revenue of the society to which it belongs, and though the metal pieces of which it is composed, in the course of their annual circulation, distribute to every man the revenue which properly belongs to no part of that revenue. Thirdly, and lastly, etc., which compose the fixed capital, bear this further resemblance consists in money. That is, every saving in the expense of erecting and which does not diminish the productive powers of labor, is an improvement of the neat revenue of the society. So every saving in the expense of collecting and supporting that part of the circulating capital which consists in money is an improvement of exactly the same kind. It is sufficiently obvious, and it has partly too been explained already, in what manner every saving in the expense of supporting the fixed capital is an improvement of the neat revenue of the society. The whole capital of the undertaker of every work is necessarily divided between his fixed and his circulating capital. While his whole capital remains the same, the smaller the one part, the greater must necessarily be the other. It is the circulating capital which furnishes the materials and wages of labor, and puts industry into motion. Every saving, therefore, in the expense of maintaining the fixed capital, which does not diminish the productive powers of labor, must increase the fund which puts industry into motion, and consequently the annual produce of land and labor, the real revenue of every society. The substitution of paper in the room of gold and silver money replaces a very expensive instrument of commerce with one much less costly and sometimes equally convenient. Circulation comes to be carried on by a new wheel, which it costs less both to erect and to maintain than the old one. But in what manner this operation is performed, and in what manner it tends to increase either the gross or the neat revenue of the society, is not altogether so obvious, and may therefore require some further explication. There are several different sorts of paper money, but the circulating notes of banks and bankers are the species which is best known, and which seems best adapted for this purpose. When the people of any particular country have such confidence in the fortune, probity, and prudence of a particular banker, as to believe that he is always ready to pay upon demand of his promissory notes, as are likely to be at any time presented to him, those notes come to have the same currency as gold and silver money, from the confidence that such money can at any time be had for them. A particular banker lends among his customers his own promissory notes to the extent, we shall suppose, of 100,000 pounds. As those notes serve all the purposes of money, his debtors pay him the same interest as if he had lent them so much money. This interest is the source of his gain. Though some of those notes are continually coming back upon him for payment, part of them continue to circulate for months and years together. Though he has generally in circulation, therefore, notes to the extent of 100,000 pounds, 20,000 pounds in gold and silver may frequently be a sufficient provision for answering occasional demands. By this operation, therefore, 20,000 pounds in gold and silver perform all the functions which 100,000 could otherwise have performed. The same exchanges may be made, the same quantity of consumable goods may be circulated and distributed to the proper consumers, by means of his promissory notes, to the value of 100,000 pounds, as by an equal value of gold and silver money. 80,000 pounds of gold and silver, therefore, can, in this manner, be spared from the circulation of the country. And if different operations of the same kind should, at the same time, be carried on by many different banks and bankers, the whole circulation may thus be conducted with a fifth part only of the gold and silver which would otherwise have been requisite. Let us suppose, for example, that the whole circulating money of some particular country amounted, at a particular time, to 1,000,000 sterling, the sum being then sufficient for circulating the whole annual produce of their land and labor. Let us suppose, too, that some time thereafter, different banks and bankers issued promissory notes payable to the bearer, to the extent of 1,000,000, reserving in their different coffers 200,000 pounds for answering occasional demands. There would remain, therefore, in circulation 800,000 pounds in gold and silver, and 1,000,000 of bank notes, or 1,800,000 pounds of paper and money together. But the annual produce of the land and labor of the country had before required only 1,000,000 to circulate and distribute it to its proper consumers, and that annual produce cannot be immediately augmented by those operations of banking. 1,000,000, therefore, will be sufficient to circulate it after them. The goods to be bought and sold being precisely the same as before, the same quantity of money will be sufficient for buying and selling them. The channel of circulation, if I may be allowed such an expression, will remain precisely the same as before. 1,000,000 we have supposed sufficient to fill that channel. Whatever, therefore, is poured into it beyond that sum cannot run in it, but must overflow. 1,800,000 pounds are poured into it. 800,000 pounds, therefore, must overflow, that sum being over and above what can be employed in the circulation of that country. But though this sum cannot be employed at home, it is too valuable to be allowed to lie idle. It will, therefore, be sent abroad in order to seek that profitable employment which it cannot find at home. But the paper cannot go abroad, because at a distance from the banks which issue it, and from the country in which payment of it can be exacted by law, it will not be received in common payments. Gold and silver, therefore, to the amount of 800,000 pounds will be sent abroad, and the channel of home circulation will remain filled with 1,000,000 of paper, instead of the 1,000,000 of those metals which filled it before. But though so great a quantity of gold and silver is thus sent abroad, we must not imagine that it is sent abroad for nothing, or that its proprietors make a present of it to foreign nations. They will exchange it for foreign goods of some kind or another, in order to supply the consumption either of some other foreign country or of their own. If they employ it in purchasing goods in one foreign country in order to supply the consumption of another, or in what is called the carrying trade, whatever profit they make will be in addition to the neat revenue of their own country. It is like a new fund, created for carrying on a new trade, domestic business being now transacted by paper, and the gold and silver being converted into a fund for this new trade. If they employ it in purchasing foreign goods for home consumption, they may either, first, purchase such goods as they are likely to be consumed by idle people who produce nothing, such as foreign wines, foreign silks, etc., or secondly, they may purchase an additional stock of materials, tools, and provisions in order to maintain and employ an additional number of industrious people who reproduce with a profit the value of their annual consumption. So far as it is employed in the first way, it promotes prodigality increases expense and consumption without increasing production, or establishing any permanent funds supporting that expense, and is in every respect hurtful to the society. So far as it is employed in the second way, it promotes the industry, and though it increases the consumption of the society, it provides a permanent fund for supporting that consumption, the people who consume reproducing with a profit the whole value of their annual consumption. The gross revenue of the society, the annual produce of their land and labor, is increased by the whole value which the labor of those workmen adds to the materials upon which they are employed, and their neat revenue by what remains of this value after deducting what is necessary for supporting the tools and instruments of their trade. Okay, that seems like a good stopping point. We will continue in our next read with the second fixture in Book 2, Chapter 2, of money considered as a particular branch of the general stock of the society, or of the expense of maintaining the national capital, in the next episode. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.